Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at the facial nerve section of the course pack. This resource is brought to you by Scrubs, which is the student collaborative resources for understanding and Brody success. My name is Bryce Pugh and I'm in the class of 2027. So let's start off with the Scrubs mission statement, which is Scrubs is a student-driven initiative that aims to develop supplemental resources for current and future cohorts that will pass through Brody. Members of Scrubs participate in a variety of subcommittees working to create resources for students by students. These resources aim to offer a unique perspective from students that have walked in the same shoes as you, developing resources that we wish we had been exposed to during our time in the course. The hope is that this organization will become a staple of the Brody student body, exemplifying the unique collaborative community that Brody offers. If this is a mission that aligns with your goals and you have the desire to help those that will come behind you, as well as the goal to leave your mark on Brody as a whole, we invite you to join the team. And a quick disclaimer, the resources that are included in this document are made by students and not the faculty. As such, there's a possibility for errors in our development, although this is mitigated via a team approach to development with multiple stages of vetting. If there's a contradiction with the coursework presented within your course, please go by the course documents. Additionally, Scrubs aims to supply supplemental resources. However, these are in no way a replacement to the instruction of the Brody faculty. Use these resources as a supplement, but not as your primary source for course material. So before we jump into the facial nerve specifics, let's look at a little bit of an overview of the head and neck with the bones and some osteology and stuff like that, just because understanding the skull and all of these foramina on the inside and outside are going to be really important for following the passageway of nerves. And so first we'll start off with some bones of the skull. Some big ones to know are going to be our frontal bone, which is up here, your forehead bone, our parietal bone, which are on the sides here, parietal meaning wall, so it's kind of the big wall of your skull. Our occipital bone, which is here at the back where you lay your head on a pillow. Our temporal bone, which is when your hair starts to go gray, it usually happens at this region. So that's temporal, that's your temporal bone. We have our sphenoid bone, which is this one in red, and this is the greater wing. It also has, so the greater wing one's up here, the lesser wing is going to run back along this, and we're going to see that a little more once we cut the top of the skull off. And so this is also actually just one bone that goes all the way across. A lot of these are kind of bilateral, but some of them are just one. And so next we have our zygomatic bone, which are going to be your cheekbones up here in the light blue color. We have our maxilla, which is this purple one here. This is going to be your upper jaw is what maxilla means. And then below that we have our lower jaw, which is our mandible. So our mandible and maxilla here. And those are going to be the main ones. There's a couple other minor ones that we'll look at later in the course. And so another key topic to understand when looking at the skull is sutures. And so whenever you look at the skull, you see all of these, it looks like they were kind of just, the bones were sewed together, all of these squiggly spots, and that's going to be the sutures of the skull. And this is because embryologically, when the skull is developing, these are not actually going to be connected. And so as they come together, they're going to close off. But when you look at a child, for example, they still haven't fully closed, and so that's why you'll see a child having a soft spot right here. And so the key sutures that we want to know, there's a couple other minor ones, is going to be looking in the anatomical planes. So we have a coronal suture here. This is looking at the top of the skull. A coronal suture in the coronal plane. We have a sagittal suture in the mid-sagittal plane. And then we have a lambdoid suture, which you can really see on the back of the skull here. And that's named for lambda, the Greek letter. It's kind of like an upside down V is what is this. We have our squamous suture, which is going to be running through here, connecting your temporal bone to the parietal bone. And that's named because this region of the skull is really flat. And so squamous comes from the word meaning flat. And we also see that with cells in the body that we name squamous when they're flat. And then finally we have arterion, which isn't labeled here, but it's this little tiny one that actually connects 4 bones. So most of these are just connecting 2. It's this tiny one that connects 4, and that's going to become important clinically, and we'll talk about why later, but it can be a point of, if you break it, it can be pretty bad. And so a little bit more osteology, just kind of to really hammer this home, because this is really important as we move forward. So if we go back to this picture, if we cut a line right through here and then remove the skull, now we're looking at the inside. We see these kind of 3 regions, and we're going to group those off as cranial fossa. And so we have our anterior cranial fossa up here, our middle cranial fossa right here, and our posterior one right here. And this is a lot more apparent in an actual skull that's not all color-coded like this, but that's going to be defined by The lesser wing of our sphenoid bone right here separates the anterior and middle, and then our petrous temporal bone right here. And so the petrous temporal bone I mentioned earlier, this is really, really hard, and it's the hardest bone in the skull, one of the hardest bones in the body, which is important because a lot of our ear and hearing structures are going to be located in here, so we want to keep those safe and protected. And posterior to that will be our posterior cranial fossa back here. We also have our ethmoid bone, which is going to be right here in yellow, and ethmoid comes from the word meaning sieve, and so this looks like a little sieve with all these little tiny holes, which are called ethmoidal foramina. Or sorry, these are called cribriform foramina. The ethmoid foramina are these ones back here and here, but the little tiny ones in there, the sieve holes, those are the cribriform foramina, and these are really important for our olfactory bulbs on cranial nerve 1. They're going to have little nerve fibers that run through here to allow smell to get sent up to your brain. And so we have that. We also have this kind of groove, this U-shaped groove right here, which is the hypophyseal fossa, or also known as the sella turcica, which stands for Turkish saddle. And this is where the pituitary gland is going to sit. The pituitary gland is really important, as you'll find out later. So it's got this kind of its own encasing right here because it's really tiny. I also want to point out, looking at an inferior view of the skull, so we have the mandible removed, the jawbone removed, and we're looking at an inferior view of the skull. So we're going to have our foramen magnum is this really big hole right here. That's the one that your spinal cord is going to go through and some other smaller things. We also have this structure right here, which is your styloid process. And so styloid means pillar. And so it's going to be like this pillar-like bone coming up through here. And that's a little apparent right here. Right there, you can see it really well. But that one's really important later on. And then you also have your mastoid process right here, which is a really hard bone. You can feel, if you put your hand behind your ear, on the kind of lower part behind your ear, you can feel right where your mastoid process is. And then, so these are going to be some important structures down here. And so now, before we get to the facial nerve still, I want to do a quick overview of the cranial nerves, and then we'll get specific. So the cranial nerves, what they are, when we've looked at nerves previously in the course, we've looked at all of these components, GSA, GVA, GSE, GVE. And so I would really recommend getting familiar with these because you're going to see them a lot in the head and neck unit. And so just a quick reminder, A stands for afferent, that's going to be sensory. E is efferent, that's going to be motor, going away from the brain. And then S is going to be somatic, so that's intentional, controlled. V is visceral, and that's kind of autonomic. And so the G here stands for general. So in addition to these general sensations, we're still going to see those here, we also have some special senses. And that's going to be things like taste, smell, sight, and hearing. And different cranial nerves are going to contain these components. And so it's also important to consider when looking at all of these, we just kind of follow a nerve pathway, but all of these are going to be bilateral. So we're going to have them coming off on both sides. There's also going to be a term that's going to come up a lot, which is branchiomotor. And this is going to be extremely relevant. This is coming from an embryological topic, which is that pharyngeal arches kind of develop as you are developing. And so within a pharyngeal arch, you're going to have a nerve, an artery, and a vein. And so when you see branchiomotor innervation, that means that the nerve is innervating the muscles or structures of the same pharyngeal arch. And then finally, I want to point out that all of the cranial nerves are purely parasympathetic. So this is all parasympathetic, which is rest and digest. Any sympathetic components in our head and neck are going to be coming from our superior cervical sympathetic ganglia. And so these are all parasympathetic. Sympathetic fibers we've looked at previously, we have our sympathetic trunk, which is going to be where all our sympathetics are. So we're going to come up here and we're going to have these ganglia. Our uppermost one is our superior cervical ganglia. And then this is going to be the synapse points of all of our sympathetic components. And so in the head and neck, any sympathetics that we see are going to be post-ganglionic. We can see that here. So if we see a ganglia in the head, then it's going to be parasympathetic synapsing. The sympathetics are just going to pass straight through it. And so our sympathetic synapse in the superior cervical ganglia, and they're going to come and form this plexus on the carotid structures. And we can see on the external and internal carotid artery that we form this plexus, and then we're going to go up and join the cranial nerves. And so now let's jump into the facial nerve. So a quick overview of the facial nerve. What we're going to do is give motor innervation to the muscles of the face. And so we can see these two are cranial nerve 7. Red is motor, green is sensory. So we're doing both here. We have motor innervation to all of our facial expression muscles. We're going to give sensory innervation to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, but specifically taste. We don't do general sensation. That's a different nerve. So this is taste to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, motor to the facial expression muscles, and we're also going to supply all of our secretory glands of the face except for our parotid gland. And so going back to this picture, we have a lot of structures and holes here that we're going to look at throughout the course, but the main one that we're going to look at here is going to be right here. This is our internal acoustic meatus. And so our facial nerve is going to come off of the brain here and then go back through our internal acoustic meatus into our facial canal. And so this is just a simplified drawing that I drew where our facial nerve comes off the brain, enters the internal acoustic meatus into the facial canal. And so we're going to follow this main pathway here as well as its branches. And so I would get really familiar with this sort of drawings. These have really helped me, especially because this chapter is really heavy on nerves and branches and what they go to. So these drawings can be a really strong tool to help you learn, as well as on test day. You can do a simplified drawing, something like this, just to quickly get it all out. And then if you need to remember what the facial nerve does, boom, you've practiced drawing this. You can now remember what these branches go to. And so let's follow the pathway of the facial nerve. So the facial nerve is going to have a lot of components. We're going to have GVA, GSA, GVE, GSE, and taste. And so what it's going to do, we said it's going to enter the facial canal at the internal acoustic meatus, which is part of the petrous temporal bone. And we're going to travel around this kind of curve. So the facial canal is this curved structure. And so at the curve, we're going to have this ganglia, this ganglion, which is the geniculate ganglion. And geniculate comes from the word meaning knee or bend. And so at the bend or the knee of the facial canal, we have the geniculate ganglion. We're then going to continue through the facial canal, and along the way, we're going to give off a couple branches. So we have one really important branch here is going to be our greater petrosal nerve. And so that's going to come off at the curve through this little spot, which is the facial canal hiatus. And so this is also pictured here. So we have our facial nerve coming down into here in the facial canal, and so this is the curve. And so at the knee, we have the geniculate ganglion. We give off our greater petrosal nerve, but the facial nerve also continues down here. And so looking at the greater petrosal nerve, it's not going to have all of those components. You can see we're simpler here, and we'll look at, I'll come back to these. So it's going to pass anteromedially is how it's described, but not through the foramen lacerum. So the foramen lacerum is kind of this small, kind of like a foramen, just because it's closed off at the bottom. So it's going to enter that, but it's not actually going to pass through. So it's going to kind of enter it and then exit halfway through. And so the way that's described in the course pack is passing anteromedially. But keep in mind, it does not actually pass through the foramen lacerum. And so it's going to continue along here, and then it's going to be joined by sympathetics. So up until this point, we're purely parasympathetic. It's going to get joined by the deep petrosal nerve right here, and they're going to come together and enter the pterygoid canal. When they're inside the pterygoid canal, they're going to change names to being the nerve of the pterygoid canal. And so the sympathetics, remember, those are coming from our superior cervical ganglia, coming to this carotid plexus, and then coming up and joining as the deep petrosal nerve. And so the nerve of the pterygoid canal is going to continue on and then exit into the pterygopalatine fossa. The pterygopalatine fossa, it might be a little confusing right now, but you're going to come back to this in a lot more depth. And so maybe try and look up a picture or two, try and visualize it, but you're going to come back to that a lot heavily later on. And so in the pterygopalatine fossa, our parasympathetics are going to come synapse, and this is going to be at the pterygopalatine ganglion. And so keep in mind, our sympathetics, they're postganglionic, so they're just going to pass right through this and go to the same structures. They're riding together, the parasympathetics and sympathetics, but only parasympathetic synapse here. And so we'll see a few of these ganglia that are kind of unique because this ganglion is purely associated functionally with the facial nerve. Structurally, it's hanging off of cranial nerve 5, V2. Cranial nerve 5 has 3 branches, 1, 2, and 3, so that's where you'll see V2, V3, V1. And so structurally, it's on V2, but functionally, it's purely facial nerve. And so we're going to synapse there, and then they're going to ride together to 3 or 4 glands. And so that's going to go to our lacrimal glands, our nasal glands, and our greater and lesser palatine glands. And so when thinking about, okay, the endpoint of all of this is to go to glands. So that makes sense that we're going to be visceral, GVA, GVE. And so we're not going to be somatic because you don't intentionally control the glands in your head. That's going to be autonomic. And so it makes sense V. We want A and E here because, one, we want to have sensory sending signal back as to if we need to secrete anything in the glands. So we need afferent sensory. We need signal to know if we need to secrete more. Once we get that signal, we need a way to secrete. So we're going to need GVE. So we need GVA and GVE. There's a really minor component of taste in this branch. I wouldn't really worry about that too much because taste is going to be a lot more important down here. But just know that the greater petrosal does have a taste component. And so going back to our facial nerve here, we're going to come down and we're going to give off a little branch that's going to go to the stapedius muscle. And that's the nerve to the stapedius. And this is branchiomotor innervation. So remember, they're coming from the same pharyngeal arch. And that's just going to be a little muscle in the ear. We'll look at that in the clinical correlations. But continuing on, we're going to, before we exit the facial canal, we're going to give off one more pretty major branch. And that's going to be our chorda tympani. The chorda tympani is going to have 2 components. That's GVE, so autonomic, efferent, and taste. And so we're going to come down, and this is going to kind of travel all around the ear. So you can see that's going to be this green branch here. So it's going to go up towards the ear, do some stuff, and then come back around here. And so you can see this little branch, which is the nerve to the stapedius. And so what we're going to do, the chorda tympani is going to come off. It's going to go to the tympanic membrane and travel over the handle of the malleus, which are one of your ossicles in your ear. It's going to travel over the handle of your malleus and enter the infratemporal fossa. So it's going to be down here. Enter the infratemporal fossa and bifurcate. The infratemporal fossa is going to be another really important space later on. Again, maybe just kind of like look up a quick picture of what that is to get an idea in your head, but you'll look at that a lot more later. And so we're going to come down here and we're going to bifurcate. And that bifurcation is going to split the 2 components. So our taste component is going to go over and travel towards the tongue. That makes sense. Taste is going to the tongue. Taste, though, is only doing part of our innervation to the tongue. And so when we look at our tongue, you can taste things, but you can also feel and you can sense temperature and stuff like that. So we need a different nerve that's giving general sensation to our tongue. And that's going to be a branch of cranial nerve 5, V3, which is going to give off the lingual nerve. And so they're going to come together and travel to the tongue. We also want to keep in mind this is specifically going to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. And this is also due to the embryological development of the tongue. It kind of develops as 2 pieces on the front, 1 in the back. And so on the front, we're getting the anterior 2/3, which is lingual, giving general sensation, and the chorda tympani does taste. So this is a really important distinction. Make sure you know that well. Going back, we also have our GVE component, which is going to come down here. So remember, this is just sensory, so we haven't synapsed yet. We're parasympathetic. We're going. We need to synapse before we get to where we go because all efferents are 2 nerves. And so we come down here, we're going to synapse in the submandibular ganglion. We're then going to continue to the sublingual and submandibular glands. So this is more glands. So the facial nerve does all the glands, remember, except the parotid gland, but we'll look at that in a second. And so the submandibular ganglion is also kind of unique. It's structurally hanging off of V3, off the lingual nerve, but functionally it is purely facial nerve. And so now let's go back over and continue down. So our facial nerve is going to exit, right here, it's going to exit our facial canal at the stylomastoid foramen, which I'll point out right here. So we pointed out our styloid process right here and our mastoid process right here. Between those, we have this little foramen, which is the stylomastoid foramen. So we're going to exit this, come down, and go to our face. And so we exit the stylomastoid foramen, come down, and we're going to give off a little branch that runs backwards. So that's going to be our posterior auricular branch. And so auricle, your auricle, auricular, whenever you see that word, you want to be thinking the ear, around the ear. And so this is running posterior to your ear, and that's going to give GSA to a couple components around your ear, as well as branchiomotor innervation to your occipitalis muscle, which is overlying your occipital bone. Okay, and then let's continue down. Facial nerve, we're going down. We're going to pass through the parotid gland. So we pointed out we do not innervate the parotid gland. We innervate all these other ones, but we're only passing through the parotid gland. We're not innervating it. And so we're going to pass through that and then give off 5 terminal branches, which are going to be the muscles of expression, muscles of facial expression. I also want to point out we have this little branch here, which is the nerve to the stylohyoid and posterior digastric. And so these are a couple muscles that you'll look at a little further into dissection and stuff like that. But keep in mind these two that are here, and then on the trigeminal nerve, we're going to have another little branch that's similar to this. So we'll make that connection later on. We have this little branch that goes to these 2 muscles. And so our terminal branches, we're going to give branchiomotor innervation, so pharyngeal arches again. Make sure you're really looking at that with the embryo section. And we're going to go these 5 branches. So these are not what we're innervating. These are the names of the terminal branches. And so we're going to have temporal, zygomatic, buccal, marginal mandibular, and cervical. So if you'd like a mnemonic, you can say them zebras be mad crazy is a good one to remember, just maybe for the quick drawing on test day or something. But a way that I like to remember it is with this picture. And so if you wrap your arm around your head and lay it on your face, your hand on your face just like this, then you can kind of work your way through what branches they're going to be. And so cervical, that makes sense. We're going to have one going to our cervical spine region, so cervical is there. Mandibular, marginal mandibular, that's going to be along our mandible. Okay, that makes sense. Let's go up here now. Temporal, that's going to be kind of at your temporal region. We talked about that, your temporal bone. That makes sense. Okay, I can remember that. And then zygomatic. Oh, remember our cheekbone is our zygomatic bone. So we were going to have one going right there. The only one that might be a little confusing at first is going to be our buccal branch. And so the buccinator is going to be one of the muscles that we look at. It is kind of in your cheek. So buccal is going to be your cheek. And so instead of trying to memorize all of that, I would kind of try and think your way through this and kind of reason it out so you don't have to memorize. And so now let's look at the muscles of facial expression that we're actually innervating. And so we have these 6 muscles are the main ones that we want to keep in mind. There's a couple other minor ones, but these are the major ones. And so first we have our frontalis. And so this is going to wrinkle your forehead and raise your eyebrows. And so as you're learning these and reading these, I would try and make the facial expression that they do with your face just to kind of associate it with the function. So frontalis up here, it's going to wrinkle your forehead, raise your eyebrows. And then we have 2 orbicularis muscles. So the orbicularis is kind of coming from orbit, circular. So it's going to be these 2 circular muscles. And we're going to have one around your eye, the oculi, and one around your mouth, the oris. And so orbicularis oculi is going to help close your eyelids. And I think of that kind of like the word occult, which is kind of hidden or closed off. So orbicularis oculi will close your eye. Orbicularis oris, oris kind of coming from the same root as oral, meaning your mouth. So around your mouth, that's going to close and protrude your lips. And so I like to think of this as the duck face muscle. So it's going to help you do the duck face pose when taking a selfie as your orbicularis oris. Next we have our buccinator, and that's going to be in here, in like deep inside your cheek. And so what it's going to do, it's going to press your cheeks against your teeth. And so when you're chewing food or something and you have this bolus in your mouth, then you're going to want it kept between your teeth. You don't want it leaking out. And so it's going to squeeze your cheeks up against your teeth and keep that inside of that when you're chewing. Next, we have our zygomaticus major. And so that's going to be going from your zygomatic bone, your cheekbone, down to the corner of your mouth. And so what that's going to do, if that contracts that way, then it's going to bring the corner of your mouth superiorly and laterally. So superolaterally. And if this gets pulled over there, that gets pulled over there, then that's going to form a smile. So a smile is more complicated. It uses a lot more muscles, but I like to think of this as the smile muscle. And so that's one of my favorites. And then finally, we have our platysma muscle, which is going to be this really thin, almost paper thin muscle going up your neck into right here. And so what this is going to do is tense your neck and skin and draw the corner of your mouth inferiorly, or help you frown. So I like to think of that as the frowning muscle. And finally, to end the video, we'll look at some clinical anatomy. And so one really important one for this chapter is going to be Bell's palsy. And so the cause of Bell's palsy is when you have an inflamed facial nerve in the facial canal. And so, again, this is going to be where it's really important to keep in mind that you have two facial nerves, one on each side of your face, or one on each side of your brain and head. And so your facial nerve is going to come down and go up here and go to all these facial muscles. And so if you have one inflamed, that's only going to be affecting one side of your face. And so the way that this is going to present in clinic is you're going to have a really droopy one half of your face. So the eyelids, the corner of your mouth, eyebrows, stuff like that, it's all going to be really droopy, but only on one side. So the other side is going to be perfectly normal. Another important thing when we're looking at nerves, of course, we always want to be thinking lesions. What would a lesion of this nerve look like? And so a lesion of the lingual nerve, if we have that, then we're going to lose general sensation to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Again, really hammer down that distinction between general sensation for lingual nerve and taste of the chorda tympani. If the lesion is after the chorda tympani and lingual nerve join, because remember they join together, so if it's after the joining, then we're additionally going to lose taste and the secretomotor function of these two glands, the submandibular and sublingual. And that's in addition to general sensation. Next, if we want to test the facial nerve, so we suspect Bell's palsy, let's see if it's actually an issue with the facial nerve. What you can do is you can have the patient mimic expressions that you're making, and if you see this sort of asymmetry, then that's kind of an initial indicator. And then you can also test it with this salt and sugar trick where you put salt on one side of their tongue, wash it off, sugar in the same spot, and wash it off, and see if they can distinguish which one is which. And you'll do that on both sides of the tongue. If on one side they can't distinguish, then that's a good indicator that the taste component of the facial nerve is messed up. And then finally, we saw earlier we had that little nerve to the stapedius. So the stapedius is a muscle as well as the tensor tympani. These are two little muscles in the ear, and they have this unique protective function, which is that when you have all this really loud noises, if you're at a concert or something, your tympanic membrane or eardrum is going to be vibrating a lot, and that's not good. So they're going to tense up, and that's going to prevent all of this excess vibration caused by the loud noises, and that'll just kind of protect your ossicles and eardrums and stuff like that.